Hi, everybody. I'm KHOU 11 meteorologist Pat Calvin here with a look at your tropical update from Houston, Texas on Hurricane Julia for Saturday, October 8th, 2022. Julia finally became a hurricane as of Saturday evening with the 6 p.m. update. Winds are now sustained at 75 miles per hour. You can see it's a pretty small core right there in the center, but a really intense core at that. Notice those brighter white and purple cloud tops there. What that indicates is really cold cloud tops. The brighter the white, the colder the cloud tops, the more intense the thunderstorms, so the more intense of a storm you've got. But again, it's really compact, so it just made it to Category 1 hurricane status. And I don't think it's really going to strengthen much more beyond that because of how fast the storm is moving, booking it to the west at about 17 miles per hour. So here's the coast of Nicaragua. So we're coming pretty close to this thing making landfall. We expect it to make landfall within the next 18 to 24 hours. And of course, from there, once it interacts with Central America, it's really going to start to weaken. It is going to be a big rainmaker. So here's the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center. Again, maybe we get that weakening to a 80 mile per hour storm. Right now we're at a 75 mile per hour storm, so we're just barely at Category 1 hurricane status. We could see a little more strengthening here before it makes landfall sometime by Sunday morning, so not even 18 to 24 hours. Within the next 12 hours, we expect landfall here again on the east coast of Nicaragua. From there, it continues across the country, weakening to a tropical storm. But notice how as we get into Sunday night and Monday morning, we could still be dealing with a tropical storm as it reemerges into the Pacific. So this storm is moving so quickly, again, to the west at 17 miles per hour, that it may not weaken that much as it moves over some of the mountainous terrain here through Central America. So there is a potential that this thing could kind of hold on to some sort of circulation as it moves into the Pacific. But the Hurricane Center does expect it to further weaken as we get into Monday afternoon, eventually dropping back down to a tropical depression. So we're not expecting anything significant in terms of storm surge, in terms of wind damage, but it is going to be a big rainmaker for Central America. In fact, by the time it's all said and done, we could see 1 to 2 feet of rain in some of the higher rain totals here. And that's not just for Nicaragua. That goes all the way north through parts of El Salvador. And as you go north into southern portions of Mexico here, Belize, Honduras, you're going to see some pretty heavy rain as well. So again, just a big time rainmaker. Mudslide is going to be a big concern with this, especially as we get into some of that mountainous terrain. And we could see some wind damage, especially here through the immediate eastern part of Nicaragua, because we could be dealing with a 70 to 90 mile per hour sustained wind storm as it comes on shore. But rain is going to be the big impact. So where does Julia go from there? What happens after it crosses over Central America? Well, we've got high pressure over the United States. We've got one high that's going to exit off towards the right. Another one dives in as we head into the end of the week. So by Friday, so about a week from now, is what we're talking about, and we'll see high pressure centered over the southern U.S. That's going to keep the storm to the south, and that's why we see the models pushing it into the Pacific Ocean. Whatever happens to it from there remains to be seen. Does it re-strengthen? Does it turn into something? Does it just kind of fall apart? That remains to be seen. Notice some of the spaghetti plots, though, do take it on this north trajectory into the Bay of Campeche, into the southern Gulf of Mexico. That's the moisture, the remnant moisture kind of getting pulled to the north. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but that does not indicate where I think the core of this storm is going to be. I really think it stays south here. And even if we do see it kind of branch off into the southern Gulf, that high is going to keep this thing far from the United States. If anything, it becomes more of a rainmaker for central portions of Mexico. So let's take a look at what I was just talking about there with the remnant moisture, right? So even if the storm's circulation, the center of the storm, falls apart, we've still got all of this moisture here in the green that's going to be left over, right? That just doesn't evaporate into thin air. That still is there, even if we don't have a storm system. So we're going to see pretty unsettled weather here, again, through Guatemala, through southern Mexico, through Honduras and Belize and Nicaragua as we go through the weekend. That moisture, though, gets pulled to the north. And the reason for that is we have an approaching cold front here in the south central United States as we get into the middle of the week. So that's not the center of the storm. That's just some of the moisture that's associated with Julia. That gets drawn to the north. And the reason for that is ahead of a cold front, you always get a south wind. So the overall wind pattern is going to help draw some of that tropical moisture farther north. And we don't even get a ton of it here across the Gulf Coast of the United States. Notice the brighter green. That indicates the real core of that moisture. That's going to stay to the south, but we get enough here that we could see some rain chances along the Gulf Coast as we get into Wednesday and Thursday. Outside of Julia, there is nothing really going on across the Atlantic. It is very, very quiet here across the main development region of the Atlantic. There's one tropical wave there across the west coast of Africa, couple of showers here through the middle of the Atlantic, and not much going on through the Caribbean. Here's Julia there on the extreme edge of the screen. So we've got Julia there on the left side of the screen. We've got a tropical wave off the west coast of Africa, but there is no expected development from that. So there is nothing going on here as we get into the middle part of the month across the Atlantic. Now, typically this time of year, where do we look for development? We typically look for the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. What do the white arrows mean? That indicates the direction that any storm would most likely take based on historical tracks this time of year. And notice how we see them originating from the Western Caribbean and then pulling north, or at least from the Atlantic and going north. Why is that? Because during the month of October, we're now in fall, and so we start to get more cold fronts diving south across the United States, as we're going to see in the middle of the upcoming week. As that happens, that helps to draw these storms to the north and then sweeps them out to the east. So that's why we typically see this kind of a pattern as we get in the month of October. Stuff starts to develop here across the western Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico, sometimes in the Atlantic. The reason why we see development in this part of the Atlantic, again, are these cold fronts that move offshore. And as you get cold fronts moving offshore, sometimes you get a little bit of spin that develops on the tail end of these cold fronts. So sometimes you get a weak system that develops here off the east coast of the U.S., but generally speaking, all of these systems go off towards the east. So when you look at the whole season, where do we fall? Well, we are well past the peak now. The peak of the season is September 10th. Here we are, October 8th, as of this update. So we are now on the decline towards the end of the season, which, by the way, does not end until November 30th, so not until the end of November. That being said, things really drop off after the middle part of October, so we are really getting close now to the tail end of the season. Have we seen tropical systems through November, through December even? Yes, remember back to 2020. It's possible. It's very, very unlikely though, and I do think that after we wrap things up with Julia, and as we get into the rest of the month, things are going to start to wind down significantly. Especially for us here in Southeast Texas. If you're watching me here in Houston, I mean, if you lived in Texas long enough, you know that it's typically around this time of year that things totally shut off for us in terms of tropics. And the reason for that, again, is this is the time of the year when we start to get cold fronts. And those cold fronts really protect us from any tropical systems because they help to steer them away from us, and they push them either out to the east coast of the U.S., towards Florida, or just out to sea in general. So that's the general trend. So that's the latest for you. That's what we got here with Hurricane Julia. Again, expected to make landfall in Nicaragua as we get into early Sunday morning. From there, it moves across Central America and potentially reemerges into the Pacific. No threats to the United States. We don't have anything threatening the United States at this point. So that's the latest tropical update. Of course, if anything changes, we'll be updating you here on this YouTube channel. You can also follow along for these longer form tropical updates on our free streaming service, KHOU 11 Plus. You can get that on Roku or Fire TV, and you can, of course, follow along on social media. Thanks for watching.